All right, well, I hope you all enjoyed lunch. For those of you who didn't see me earlier, I'm Arik Burakovsky. I'm the Assistant Director of the Russia and Eurasia Program here at Fletcher, and it's my pleasure to introduce the next session. This is our third session of the conference on trading with the enemy. We will explore what explains the substantial volumes of trade that persist between Russia and the West, despite sanctions, including in natural gas, agricultural products and fertilizers, titanium, tech services, and why has there not been a complete economic decoupling of Russia and the West, and what implications does that have for the future? So I will turn it over to my colleague Mikhail Troitsky, who is a visiting scholar both at Fletcher and at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Fletcher. The Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. And I should mention that this session is supported by the Hellenic and European Studies Chair here at Fletcher. And without further ado, Mikhail.
Yeah, thank you very much, Eric. I have to.
Yeah. There you go.
Yeah, so thank you all for coming and for staying for this panel. So we have an impressive lineup of speakers now, and I won't be introducing them, giving their credentials. They're all up on this screen. So yeah, we have so far been able to establish in this conference that sanctions are apparently the worst instrument of statecraft except all the others. And yeah, but how about loopholes? Let's discuss loopholes. So the only thing I wanted to say is that apparently the default or the time-tested approach to dealing with systemic threats to international order and security has been the policy of containment, right? It did work in the past. And, when the panelists previously wondered about restrictions imposed by Western governments on the movement of capital, labor migration out of Russia, I think this goes back to the experience of containment that is considered to be quite successful and effective, right? It helped avert many threats. And then the Soviet system did implode, just as George Kennan predicted a long time ago. But trading with Russia by Western counterparts kind of contradicts the logic of 360-degree containment. So why is this happening? Why the interest of those counterparts in the West trading with Russia is clear, but where do Western governments stand on that? And are they under pressure from industry lobbyists? Are they afraid of disrupting global flows of trade and finance, or do they have some strategic considerations? And most interestingly, what happens if Russia commits more atrocious acts in the Russo-Ukrainian war? Will the pressure on those who trade with Russia mount, or we have already reached a plateau so that the status quo isn't going to be affected? So I hope we can address some of those questions. And without further ado, let me just turn it over to Professor Kapela-Zelinsky, who is the first to speak.
Hi, how's everybody? Good, I hope. We've eaten, lovely. I don't know about people online, hopefully they've eaten too. So I'm here to talk about maritime insurance. So one thing that the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine really shine a spotlight on is threat to trade, notably the Russian blockade of the Black Sea and EU sanctions on various Russian entities. And in both scenarios, maritime insurance was at the center. Regarding the Black Sea, ensuring maritime insurance, has been critical continuing trade, notably in Ukrainian grain exports. And regarding EU sanctions, maritime insurance has been weaponized with Russia's main reinsurer as targets. So I'm going to spend my time here today about why insurance is at the center of this conflict in various ways. For those unfamiliar with maritime insurance, it's a for-profit industry, we're going to come back to that in a second, that covers various risks and perils associated with the transporting of goods and cargo over water. with over 80% of the volume of international trade of goods that's carried by sea, and the percentage higher of most developing countries, it underpins all global trade, and it is required to have maritime insurance at every port in the world. It's a Western dominated industry, mostly centered in London, with various underwriters collectively providing coverage and liability. They are often part of an association, such as, or a syndicate, such as the Lloyd's of London, which helps coordinate insurance and reinsurance rates, among other things. All ships carry various forms of insurance to life, crew, the ship itself, associated machinery, and its cargo. So turning to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Russia mined the Black Sea to prevent Ukrainian grain exports from leaving the country, resulting in a de facto blockade of its seaports. In addition to mine, Russia attacked Ukrainian ports and various ships with drones and missiles. And this is a problem for global agriculture. Ukraine being responsible for about 10% of global wheat exports, 15% of global corn and barley exports, and 50% of global sunflower and oil exports, mostly going to predominantly lower income countries in Africa. And you may have remembered the headlines of an international food crisis and spurring the continuation of trade. So how did we get trade going? To be sure, if you recall, the UN Black Sea Grain Initiative from the summer of 22 to the summer of 23, which enabled Ukrainian ships to about 33 million metric tons of agricultural products to leave through the ports. But this ends. And upon it ending, we saw a resumption of attacks on various ships going through the Black Sea. Immediately after, there was an attack on a Libyan flagged vessel, which killed injured four crew, killing 3, which were Filipinos. Okay, so what are your options? Option 1, you go another route. This is less efficient, right? Costly rail, road, river routes to the EU solidarity lanes. But that wasn't always treated so well. Hungary and Poland at times have threatened to block access to roads amid protests from local farmers. And the EU had to provide funding for these neighbors to smooth their disgruntlement. So option 1, longer route, more costly. Option 2, stay the route, right? Having grain leave through the Black Sea, hope for security guarantees, and absorb the risk of conflict via insurance. Here comes maritime insurers. War premiums, as I said, every ship has to have maritime insurance. When the war breaks out, insurance premiums skyrocket to about 10% of the value of the ship's hull. So we need something to lower that price, to have shippers incur the risk of continuing commerce, and enter a state-backed insurance regime with a public-private partnership. In the summer of 2023, and perhaps earlier, conversations began about a supplemental state-backed insurance. In other words, the state, a not-for-profit entity, absorbing some of that war risk to place downward pressures on these wartime insurance prices. The European Bank for Reconstruction and Development was one of the early international actors at the Ukraine Recovery Conference in London in 2023, signing a statement of intent to relaunch the private insurance market in Ukraine by working joint with market and public sector stakeholders to guarantee facility. Ukraine and Britain have agreed on a special mechanism for discounts on war risk insurance on exports through the Black Sea corridor, the so-called Unity Facility. It's a multinational public partnership amongst the US and UK-based insurance companies Marsh McLennan and Lloyd's of London with the Ukrainian government, including the Ministry of Economy, the Export Credit Agency Ukraine, and 2 Ukrainian state banks, backed by Germany's DZ Bank. So the Ukrainian state banks extend up to 50 million in hull and state protection and indemnity war risk insurance to ship owners, and the facility issues cargo insurance with the backing of the Ministry of Ukraine. And it goes even better. The Unity Facilities Ukraine, they offer first letters of credit to provide first loss compensation to ship owners and charters. So they absorb the first level of cost, which helps backfill and provide less risk exposure in the market. And these insurers have come in to provide extra additional assistance to the Ukrainian government. Marsh, for example, Marsh McLennan, provided insurance expertise, including building a data platform from the assessment of war risk, strategic advisory service, and catastrophic reinsurance modeling. And all of this has led to an impressive level of market stability. Your last question, will the status quo prevail over something else as continuing attacks? And let me note that this political risk insurance in Ukraine to spur the Ukrainian economy has gone far beyond maritime insurance, although this is beyond my area of expertise. The Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, the political risk insurance arm of the World Bank, has provided the equivalent of 215 million in guarantees to Ukraine since the start of the war. The U.S. International Development Finance Corporation has recently announced an additional funding package for political risk insurance as well. The big concern now is getting reinsurers back into the market. Reinsurers insure insurers. So many levels of insurance and risk down. So reminding you that war insurance is a for-profit industry which wants to mitigate its own risk and exposure. And so when the war broke out, reinsurers all pulled out of the region to limit their own exposure, which, by the way, had not to do with Ukraine in and of itself. It's a global for-profit industry and had taken losses in other areas, and they have not re-entered the market. I am not timing myself, so I'll wrap this up, assuming I'm going over. Great, thank you. And just to add some fun to the mix, as I was told by a colleague, the Red Sea came up earlier today. About 40% of Ukraine's maritime wheat shipments relied on our Red Sea route, as does Russia and European grains to get to their destination markets. Happy to do my best to answer questions there. And I hear you have a panel on energy tomorrow. So to deny trade, you can physically deny trade, right? You can mine your ports. You can have drone and missile strikes, or in the Western route, you can weaponize insurance. You can say, if insurance is required, hey, Russia insurers and reinsurers and anyone providing insurance to oil tankers and whatnot, if you go over the price cap, we will no longer provide insurance. So I open it for you guys tomorrow to think about how insurance has been weaponized in the West to make it harder for Russia to continue its own trade. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Zelinsky. And the next to speak is Dr. Ribakova, who joins us online.
Hi, thank you for inviting me, and it's a pity that I can't be with you in the room, but I will do my best to provide you with interesting stuff regarding IT and specifically software, which I was asked to give some overview what's going on in this particular field, a little bit different from the previous input, but still, so I hope we can find connection to all of this. Yeah, so just to give you maybe a very, very short overview what we are talking about, because I think when we talk about technological sanctions, it's important to understand in which unprecedented field we are in. Because if we look at the whole measures which were introduced by the United States and the European Union, as well as the leading technological countries, it's interesting to see that practically there are no rooms for maneuver for Russia. So because firstly, there is an export control so in place, which obliges American and European companies to get a license for a wide range of technologies before they export them to Russia. So also the Bureau of Industry and Security, so BIS, included in its entity list all Russian and foreign companies which potentially contribute to Russia's military and requires them to obtain a license too before shipping them to country. And there is this well-known, the foreign direct product rule, which was introduced by the United States on the entire country. And this rule applies to any export, re-export, or transfers to Russia of foreign produced items if they are manufactured with US equipment based on US components or use US technology listed in their commerce control list under the product group software and technology. And remarkably, that the European Union and dozens of leading producing nations, including the United Kingdom, Japan, South Korea. They also joined the United States in committing to impose similar substantial controls so that the US doesn't need to introduce secondary sanctions on these countries if they export certain technologies with US component. And just 2 weeks ago, there are new actions by the US Department of the Treasury Office of Foreign Asset Control, which restrict the export, re-export, sale, or supply of services to Russia from the US or US persons relating to IT consultancy and design, as well as IT support services or cloud-based services for enterprise management software and design and manufacturing software. And just a couple of days later, the BIS also introduced a new rule which requires a license to export enterprise management software and design and manufacturing software to Russia and Belarus. And we already observed that several services and IT consultancy company said that they will stop their business in Russia after these new requirements were introduced. Second block is the sanctions, and I'm sure you're aware about different lists, so especially the special designated nationals list, the list that the EU introduced with companies, persons, research institutes which are prohibited or which prohibit the American, European companies doing business with the blacklisted persons and companies and governmental bodies and research institutes. So this is another important part of it. And then we have the third block, which is withdrawal of Western companies from the Russian market. So partly because several companies wanted to show their solidarity with Ukraine and condemn Russia's invasion, and partly because they were just super cautious, and it's quite complicated to navigate these restrictive measures, and it's just for some of them were easier just to pull out their business out of the country. And here, despite of the fact that we are in the war for more than 2 years, we see that not all Western IT companies have exited the Russian market completely. According to the Kiev School of Economics, there are 36% of foreign IT companies which have stayed in Russia. I have to say that it includes also Chinese companies, so they're not only American and European ones. But still, so they continue their business as usual, and there are about 53% of companies which are living in the country, meaning that they scale down their activities, but they're still there and provide their services. And only 10% exited Russian market completely. If we look at the online services, this is a similar situation. So 35% stayed, and 56% are living their country, and 9% exited completely. I have to say this is complicated to say for 100% that a company exited the market or not. On example of Google, so you might know that its status is complicated. So because Google does not have any incomes in Russia, and at the same time, the company still provided services for the Russian people, which includes, first of all, YouTube, and with Google Maps, cloud, Android system, and so on. And I think it's quite important to differentiate it, because we just can't say like all companies should exit the Russian market. So if we look at the services of Google or again Meta or Cloudflare, they, from my point of view, make good job in preventing the Kremlin to completely have the information control over the country and information flows. Yes, and despite all this very robust package of restrictive measures, we see that Russia managed to navigate between them, managed to use Western technology for itself, and different estimation from different very good experts are that Russia will need several years to completely make a shift from the Western technologies. We mostly speak about software to domestic alternatives. So it will definitely take time while Russia is still using several services and several software. And just starting with a very, very simple example is the desktop operating system. Windows is the most used operating system in Russia with 84% market share. And in general, if we look at the operating systems, so like which includes also mobile. So this is again, so Windows is an absolute leader, followed by Android and then iOS. So we don't have any Russian operating system. Looking at the banks,
Could you please wrap up in 1 minute?
Sure. I will do so. Okay, then I will spare some other example with banks, which just to say in one sentence, they're not able to completely shift their security systems to Russian alternatives. They still depend on Western software. If we look at the traffic, again, Russia is very much connected to Europe. We see that the majority of the traffic generated in Russia is from Europe. And my last point, which we might discuss later, would be maybe not only to look at the companies from the US and Europe which stayed in Russia, but also which kind of dynamics this restrictive measure caused within Russia. And looking at the domestic software market, we see that there are a lot of companies which benefit from the situation. We see increase in income in comparison to previous years. And we also see kind of a momentum for these companies which use the situation and which also shows that there is a need in alternatives and Russia is moving to domestic alternatives. At the same time, I think it's interesting to look at the export data, which shows that the Russian software developers are struggling with the foreign markets. So not only with Western ones, which were usually the destination for many software developers of Russia, but also with other regions, with South Asia, and also the so-called post-Soviet states. We observe decrease in export share of Russia software developers. Thank you. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Epifanova. Professor Grinberg.
I'm not a doctor, but thank you for calling me.
For the promotion.
Hi, everyone. Oh, do I have to do anything with it?
You're supposed to turn it on.
Must
So,
be,
right behind, like on the other side. Yep, there you go.
Are we good? Okay, excellent. So I thought that what I would do today is see how far we can get analyzing US sanctions from the point of view of a framework that studies trading with the enemy. So when I say trading with the enemy, what I mean is actual wartime cooperation between two belligerents in war. The general framework that explains why states would do this kind of goes a little bit like this. When states are formulating their wartime commercial policy, they have to balance two opposing incentives. On the one hand, wartime trade with the enemy helps the enemy increase its military capabilities, which can, of course, alter the course of the war. On the other hand, severing trade with the enemy during the war reduces the revenue available to the state, which affects the funds that the state can funnel into its own security. This creates the fundamental problem of trading with the enemy. States have a security imperative to sever all trade with the enemy, and at the same time, they have an economic imperative to keep all trade with the enemy. This problem can be to a large extent resolved by looking at trade at the product level. Some products are of immediate use on the battlefield, while others take a particularly long time to be converted into military capabilities, which means that the security imperative only demands that products with a short conversion time are prohibited in war. At the same time, products also vary in the amount of revenue that they generate for the economy, which means that the economic imperative only demands the protection of trade that will significantly alter the long-term security of the state, which means there is sufficient overlap for wartime trade to legitimately exist between two warring nations. Wartime commercial policy has to be tailored to the war that the state expects to fight. War expectations work as thresholds that tell a state how short of a conversion time is too short, how important the amount of income is generated by the product for the state's economy. So in general, if a product's conversion time into military capabilities is greater than the expected length of war, trade can be permitted. The enemy simply will not have the time for the trade to alter the conditions on the battlefield. If a product's contribution to the economy of a state is above the threshold designed by the states given the stakes of the war, trade can be permitted because the state cannot afford to give up the significant revenue into its own security. This is the general framework. In order to apply it to the United States policy in the Ukraine war, we sort of need to make two additional assumptions, which I'm hoping you're willing to take with me. The first is that we need to interpret the Ukraine war as a proxy conflict for the United States, because that's the closest we can get to the United States actually being a belligerent in this war. Otherwise, it's sort of a non-neutral. The second assumption is that the belligerents involved in proxy warfare face similar incentives in the formulation of their wartime commercial policies as those that are actually involved in war. The most significant difference here is that the stakes of the war will necessarily be much, much lower than for an actual belligerent. So no matter how much the United States professes that the war in Ukraine is of a priority to its foreign policy, the stakes will never be as high as they will be for Ukraine. So if those two assumptions are granted, then we can start interpreting US sanctions in terms of this particular framework. And given that it's not a belligerent, it has two branches to its economic statecraft. The first branch follows the traditional punishment logic of sanctions against states who violate norms of international order. So the goal is generally to degrade the standard of living of stakeholders in the Russian regime with the expectation that will place sufficient pressure on Putin to change Russian foreign policy. This is mostly reflected in the luxury sanctions on Russia. I will not be focusing on that at all today. The second branch approximates a wartime commercial policy in its desire to balance the state's economic and security imperatives and weaken the war effort of the opponent. This is largely reflected in the industry sanctions on Russia. So before I get to the actual information about trade, I'll apologize, but I have to grossly oversimplify the military course of the war because, again, wartime commercial policy has to be tailored to the war that's being fought. So again, gross oversimplification, so go with me. At the start of the war in February 2020, the widespread belief was basically that this war is going to be a fait accompli. Russia is going to win within 5 days. Sort of the comparable analogy here was the Russo-Georgian War, which was over in 5 days. So in that short amount of time, no wartime commercial policy could possibly have an effect on the battle. As is frequently true in wars, the initial predictions of outcomes proved completely incorrect. Russian strategy managed to get some gains in the south, did not manage to get enough gains in terms of taking the capital. Due in large part to Western weaponry and intelligence, Ukraine helped push the Russian forces back. Starting around May 2022, US intelligence assessments shifted to predicting a longer war, but one where Ukraine could hold off Russian troops such that wartime commercial policy could once again be on the table. Autumn of 2022, Ukrainian counteroffensives showed significant promise. We're taking territory. Assessments of the length of war stretched into very likely to reach the next year. So we're reaching long war predictions of war. By winter of 2022, expectations are of a long conflict that might or might not end. We don't know when the end date is. So basically we have fait accompli. Ukraine can hold their own. Long war, incredibly long war. So given these expectations, we can map on how the US sanctions policy against Russia changed and how their wartime commercial policy was reflected how the war was changing. So again, at the start of the war, when there was no expectation that the war would last longer than 5 days, we see absolutely no wartime commercial policy. We have luxury sanctions, we see punitive sanctions, we don't see anything that largely affects Russia's ability to bring something to bear on the military battlefield. Around the first turning point in May of 2022, when the Ukraine is all of a sudden expected to stay in the war long enough for economic warfare to have an effect, we see industry sanctions being implemented for the first time. These prohibitions include numerous products that would be of use to the Russian war effort and to the defense production. So we have engines being prohibited, shovels, bulldozers, radio transmitters, medical surgical equipment, things that are of immediate use on the battlefield. There's also things like wood articles, a few articles of iron and steel and industrial machinery, which would help with defense production. At this point, the prohibitions are set at very particular 10-digit level of the harmonized tariff schedule. You don't need to know what that is. Basically, very, very specific, very, very targeted sanctions. Move forward towards the fall of 2022, 4 months into the fighting. Now we have expectations that the war will last into at least another year, given that the expectation of war changed. Now products that have longer conversion times are also of danger to be traded with the enemy. So we have prohibitions that become a lot more general. So everything that was prohibited at the 10-digit level switches to prohibitions at the 6-digit level, which means a lot more products are now prevented from going to the enemy. At the same time, we have things that include components of and parts of products being prohibited from trade. This is code for intermediate products that could over time be used in the creation of things that are useful on the military battlefield. So the longer the conversion time, the longer war is required for those to be prohibited. Fast forward a little bit, May 20 of 23, a year and 3 months into the war, this is when we see the United States finally prohibiting raw materials from being exported to Russia. So plastics, rubbers, wood, cork, nickel, cobalt, that kind of stuff. Raw materials have an even longer conversion time, therefore they get prohibited even longer into the war. I'll skip the imports because I'm running out of time. Happy to answer questions of that. I just want to add with one final note on enforcement. Given that I come to this from the point of view of wartime commercial policy, the ability to enforce practically a complete standstill to global trade is known to countries. The laws to do it and to give governments the power to do it is on the books for most European and definitely for the United States. So the ability to impose complete and total economic devastation by halting trade with Russia is available. So given that, I think we should interpret the fact that governments have not chosen to use those tools as a choice based on the costs and the benefits of using them. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Grinberg. Dr. Ribakova.
Thank you very much. So I will speak more about sort of brief and affectionate history of Russian sanctions, also from a different perspective. So I think the first and foremost sanctions, and we heard it earlier today, sanctions are a tool of policy. It's not a silver bullet. They do not kill dictators. They do not kill vampires. So we shouldn't expect them to do too much, right? So it is a technocratic tool, and it should be treated as such. So I often get a question, do sanctions work? Well, they don't work, right? If you have in the US a sales tax and everybody transacts in cash and nobody has a cash register, don't say that consumption taxes do not work, right? It's something problem. So there's a problem with administration. So I think it's very important because we get so emotional about sanctions. We think about it without sort of analytical capacity. We don't think, where is the policy failure, whether it's income or consumption tax is most appropriate. Where's the administration failure? Remember the Greek debt crisis, we had an issue there with tax administration, right? So maybe there is an administration failure. So I think that's very important. We need to move them back. And as Daniel has written books about it, we need to move them back to being a technocratic tool with clear, measurable objectives. Again, on the objectives front, if you are a government official and you don't have a target, you will never miss it. It's a wonderful situation, but it's not a very practical situation. So we do need to have a clear, measurable objectives and bring our sanctions back to that position. Then, if we think about the efficacy of the sanctions, and I'm really happy that my colleagues are here on the panel, is let's think about a ladder, escalation ladder or the cost ladder. There's something that is least costly to us, from least costly to the most costly, and the other way around for the opponent. We want to flip that and find the least costly for us, the most costly for them. And if you think, if you speak to most of the government officials, some former government officials sitting around here, and were speaking earlier, this is what the objective in 2014, and this was the objective in 2022. In 14, it worked wonderfully. Why? Because Russia was a small part of the financial markets. The fact that Gazprom had difficulties borrowing on the international capital markets, well, tough luck. There will be some bankers in London that will not make money, but, you know, on the grand scale of things, it's not a big thing. So it was really not very costly for us to chop off big chunks of the Russian financial industry and other industries from borrowing on the global capital markets. So we found this ideal thing. And if you listen to some of the Dalip Singh speeches, this is exactly what he talks about. So we found that thing. So size of the country and the market power of the country matters. And we see it from the theoretical point of view. And actually, we have a paper with Oleg Etsohi coming out. We're looking at theory and practical terms, which I think just came out maybe today. So it matters. If you have market power, you can exercise that market power. And Russia has a lot of market power in oil. And that's why they found the thing, which is maybe costly to them, but potentially more or less costly to us. And here we're bringing it back to the technocratic conversation. We need to have an open technocratic conversation. How costly is it? I think Timofey was talking about it earlier. We need to have models. We need to think about the substitution effects. We need to have an open discussion rather than a closed door discussion, which comes up with, it's a frank conversation here. What comes up with nonsense tools like oil price cap. You know, I'm going to sell you water here more expensively than next door. How do you think how successful I'm going to be? You know, how much of a market intervention I will need to do to barricade that door to make sure you don't go next door, right? It is a ex ante, a very challenging economic tool to be able to enforce. So because we don't have an open conversation saying, look, it is very costly to us, we decided, or not, you know, we have an academic and policy conversation with government officials, and maybe we give our models and say, look, you know, like recently, I think, from Dallas Fed, there was a paper, and others will say, well, this is how much it is more costly. This is the cost of production, and Sergey and others have done, you know, studies here. This is the cost of production, and Craig, in Russia. They will still sell oil to us, you know, so let's analyze that and then have a discussion. Instead, we were sort of covering it up with targets, non-targets, and we ended up with a situation where we want to have a cake and eat it too. So a technocratic approach, measurable objectives, and you know, clear measurable objectives. So size and the market power matters. Cost to us, cost to sender matters. And then the third one here in terms of efficacy, unity and enforcement, right? So if we are, it's like in economics, am I a large open economy, or am I slow and the price setter, or am I small open economy and I'm a price taker? So if you manage to take a big enough coalition that is supporting the sanctions, then we have more chance of success. If our coalition is relatively smaller and enforcement problematic, well, then of course the chance of our success is smaller as well. And I'm very glad that colleagues here talked about enforcement and sort of the motivations of continued trade with Russia. So I'm going to again continue with my brief but affectionate history. Remind you that we have three key tools. I'm now very self-conscious here because Peter is standing there. There we have three tools that we used against Russia. And thank you so much for giving the history. So first, financial sector sanctions. Partially, I'm wonderfully delighted to be enlightened by Mariya about the sort of the war context. But to me also, from the economics perspective, was the reason we did it is because when you have a hammer, you find a nail. So US worked on getting this hammer of financial sector sanctions for the last 20 or 30 years. They gave, we have international organizations, anti-money laundering. We drilled every central bank's head with FATFA and other regulations. We have given multi-billion-dollar fines to HSBC, BNP Paribas, and many other banks. Finally, when you say financial sector sanctions, financial industry says, how high do I need to jump? So that's why we did that first, because that's what something that we could do first. Then we started getting a bit more creative. Indeed, we've done export controls and we have done oil. Export controls do not work. Here are some books been written here on this topic, right? Export controls, I mean, I'm being obviously exaggerating, but it is very hard to make them work because we don't have the toolbox yet refined to be able to enforce them. So if you think about these critical components, the so-called battlefield goods, they fell in 2023 only by 10% in dollar value. So if you look at the first days after the announcement, when people thought that we'll be very serious with export controls, and then some of them were indeed announced in spring of 2022, you have a fall of 70%, and then it almost recovers by the end of the year. Because Russia, in the beginning, companies get scared. They think, oh my goodness, is it the same as financial sector sanctions? Do I need to be afraid? And they realize, oh, actually, not really. And I'll keep on going. And for those who would like to know more, I recommend two things to read. One is the permanent subcommittee on investigations in U.S. Congress. There is now hearings going on where the top companies, Intel, Texas Instruments, and everybody had to present. I did take bets with colleagues who will cry first among the representatives of these companies. And the second thing I do recommend to watch is Thank You for Smoking, the movie. I think it also tells you a lot about export controls enforcement indirectly. And then the last one on the oil price cap, again, does US have critical leverage in the oil market? No, it doesn't. And I'm very glad we can talk more about insurance, and I hope we'll have more questions on it. But US tried to intervene. Sanction is a market intervention. You try to intervene in the market where you don't control the critical nodes. You control the critical nodes in finance, you don't control them on oil. If you want to do it successfully in oil or export controls, you'd better go back to the hammer, secondary sanctions. And we have been very careful about not doing the secondary sanctions for political reasons. We can also talk about more here. So I think I'll stop here and pass it on back. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Ribakova. And I think we should really open it up. But I feel a duty as the moderator here to just ask one short question, and that is likely to be my last question. So, and I'd be grateful if all of you could just address it maybe quickly. So how about the power of ethics? So you have all just presented us with cogent rationalist analysis and cases, you know, either for or against sanctions, and kind of we're trying to find equilibria based again on rationalist analysis. But yeah, but has the power of ethics ever worked here for, say, the CEOs of the companies that trade with Russia? And if not, why? Or for politicians, ethics is already factored into their rational calculations of costs and benefits of trying to, you know, tighten the screws on their companies trading with Russia. So anything you could add about the power of ethics? You dismiss it completely, or does it somehow align with your models? Can it be factored into your models and analysis? Thank you very much.
Maybe I start quickly because we did it. Kyiv School of Economics does a study about Leave Russia. And we have at this stage, I think, almost 3,000 companies with the web scraping, not I, but my colleagues do the web scraping announcements, and we see what happens. So we actually since I'm an economist, I did a Bayesian analysis on how different companies behave. So we broke them into categories of stay, leave, and wait. And statistically speaking, the stay and wait company, or maybe no further investment kind of company, they behave exactly the same. So that is interesting. So basically, it's a polite way of saying I'm staying, but I'm just going to pretend that I'm not. And then also there was early on in 2022 a discussion about companies leaving and ethics and whatnot. So if you look at the type of companies that left, these were consumer companies with consumer fast-moving goods selling companies with limited physical investment in Russia. So if we have an expectations of a country contracting by 4%, 5%, 10% that year, no matter what sanctions or no sanctions, also you have the cost of highly unpredictable regulatory regime. What are you going to do? The fast-moving consumer goods are going to slow down. So it's there's a very strong signal that they just behaved as economic agents without thinking about much ethics. You know, countries that act companies that also had a big exposure to the local market, for example, I don't know if you're selling more shoes in Denmark than you're selling in Russia, well, the chances are maybe somebody will blockade you. It makes sense to withdraw. But for example, companies that are more entrenched, that either serving oil and gas industry in Russia or had big investments in Russia, we still see them very grudgingly trying to continue operating in Russia. So the numbers, I think, speak for themselves. And I'm going back to that testimony that you should absolutely watch, where one of the companies was explaining how a 15-year-old toothbrush chips are being used for sonic missiles in Russian missiles. So beware when you're using that toothbrush. Imagine if it goes wrong in your mouth, what's going to happen?
Okay, thank you. Any other insights about the power of ethics, so much for ethics. Okay, let's open it up. Yes, please.
From the university. Question probably for Elina, but anyone can have a stab. I agree with a lot of what you said in terms of the enforcing export controls, and the fact that you can't really analogize financial sanctions to export controls because it's fundamentally different in terms of who's compliant. One thing I want to ask is about European businesses in particular, because I think there are a lot of the research that I've seen is a lot of the European companies are still selling a lot of stuff to Russia that's just going through transshipping networks. To what extent do you think that multilateralism and the fact that the US has built this big coalition on export controls kind of counterintuitively hindered the West's policy? Because we've been looking to governments like Germany to enforce export controls on German companies as opposed to using the cudgel of American secondary sanctions to actually enforce those sanctions on a German company.
Well, I think it's a fantastic policy question from somebody very experienced. Yes, we had an open trade-off when we decided that we're going to bring into the umbrella of US export controls. If you remember, we beat up on US export controls a lot because there's something to beat up on. If you look at European system, there were no really export controls. So that's why, we don't beat up much on them because there is nothing to beat. So they had a very narrow definition of export controls before this war. And then we decided to have a coalition. So where we bring them into the fold and this foreign direct product rule that Alona has talked about, it's part of the US, as if it's part of the US. In Europe, if US stops going harder, whatever it does, with BIS export controls, and I have the greatest respect for the BIS people working on it, there's nothing in Europe. Europe cannot really do export controls, and that is a huge problem. We are still at the stage, if you remember when we used to do bank financial sector stress testing and the financial sector experts didn't have access to bank accounts because it was confidential. So in Europe, we still have an issue where they can't get trade data. So the analysts working on the export controls enforcement in Germany, they cannot get trade data and the itemized and the company level because it's confidential. So they haven't even worked out truly a mechanism how to do it. So we even have glitches at such a basic level. So yes, it is a problem. I think it is possible to work it out, but we need to be very aware that there are big differences between finance and companies. Finance, US controls critical nodes, right? And Henry Farrell and others have written books about that. Finance, you have a risk of bank runs. Those who remember ABLV Latvia, you just have the 311, you have suspicion then worse than money laundering, the bank is done, even though it has the perfect liquidity ratios and everything else. We're going to stop buying Intel chips, right? That's a bit more complicated. And then also finance is a highly regulated industry, corporates are not. I think where we can change the dial is that multi-billion-dollar fines on Intel. And then we will wake up Wall Street analysts to their potential. For example, in that hearing that we testified, Senator Johnson came out and said, look, but it's only 0.8% of Texas Instruments revenues. And I'm like, I think you probably meant profits, but it's ginormous, right? If you were to say that about the bank would be under in seconds, right? So he was trying to help them out. It worked the other way around. So basically, if we could say that the fine could be of this magnitude, then the Wall Street will wake up, then there will be wholesale funding concerns, and then maybe we can do something about the companies as well and their ethics.
Thank you very much. Let's take one from that side. Yes, please.
Thank you all so much for your great comments. My question is for Professor Kapela-Zielinski on the insurance market in particular. You had mentioned about getting private sector reinsurers back into the market. Leaving aside the issues of the lack of capacity now so far, I guess, why do we care if it's private sector or public sector, right? The public sector is increasingly writing, cyber insurance. I think it has a role to play in there. Do we care if it's private sector or public sector? Or should we focus on the private sector or focus on getting the public sector to do more of this? Thank you.
It's a great question. Mariya was there. I suggested with private sector that maybe we should have more state-backed insurance and schemes, and they were not happy with that suggestion whatsoever, given that it's a for-profit industry. And I think we need to think about, so who is the we, and do we care? And to me, we care in the long run, in that, does the state have the capacity and the means and the funds to keep backing up insurance and reinsurance for a foreseeable period of time? right? So it's not just even Ukraine and Ukrainian state banks. You have various different multilateral institutional arms coming into play, backed by Germany's banks into play, right? So it has to be this deeper partnership for the long run. So you can have moments when you have state backed, but I don't think there's the financial capacity, nor to take it seriously to actually cover that level of risk. But I should note that from what I've seen, that there hasn't really been a war risk profit hit, right? There aren't these claims coming in for damage that are bankrupting the insurance industry. That's coming in from other areas, right? Natural disasters. They're taking a way bigger hit on their profit structures that I've seen, and it's not coming from this.
Thank you.
Anyone on this side? Oh, yes, please.
Great. Davis, two quick questions for Elina, Dr. Ribakova.
No, thank you. I'll take that.
First, just on export controls. I'm wondering if it might be helpful to distinguish between export controls on commodities versus high-end technology. Because if we look at high-end technology like specialized refining technology or LNG liquefaction technology, where it's not just you can't bring this stuff through third countries. You actually have to have teams who are going in and regularly maintaining and updating, et cetera. Whether those forms of export control might actually be effective, and whether there's something to learn. And then secondly, on the shadow fleet, or not the shadow fleet, but the price cap itself, I just want to clarify, do you think the price cap is dead, or it's something that could be implemented if we are willing to use secondary sanctions? And I point specifically to the ability to sideline 15% of the shadow fleet just with the threat of secondary sanctions. Whether that's something where we might be able to, if we have a rule to expand that, could be the price cap. Somewhat.
Thank you so much. I think you're sort of driving your question about the intellectual ability and the research ability in the government, right? To be able to do truly this high-end technology, we need to be experts in the military, we need to be experts in the oil and gas, we need to have this expertise. So there is a big debate, and I think we're going to probably have more hearings in Congress. Is it the lack of authority for BIS, and maybe we need another Patriot Act, or maybe they have ample authority, we just don't have the funding. So, and we have seen studies where their funding in real terms hasn't changed in 10 years. And you have seen colleagues from BIS going to the Munich Security Forum, which tells you just how important they are now to our national security doctrine, right? So I agree with you. I think going for the limited number of goods that are high end, that really undermine Russia's ability to develop new projects and also to develop new weapons, that is critical. Because going after everything, as maybe Mariya will want to take this question more, is at this stage politically is not possible. We're not going to cut off all chips to Russia. That is not workable. So absolutely, this is the area we've all been trying to work on. I think there will be also a later panel today on CNC tools or tomorrow. So I think that is where everybody's trying to work towards. On the price cap itself, the Frankenstein is here. It seems to be politically staying. We have to work with it. We've invested so much political weight into it. Let's stay with this. But I think, also the idea that, while you and my colleague Ben at KSC sort of have championed is sanctioning the tankers themselves. I think that is very, very strong message. And if we could be going at a couple of, 20, 30 per month, we would have a significant impact, which at the same time might not have the impact on the global oil markets that we all worry about. It also will have an impact on protecting the birds and others around Europe, right? So I think that is very effective. Why? Because earlier the panel, somebody talked about the adaptability of Russia, that it has a lot of still private business. So what was happening in Moscow is that if I can borrow money from a state-controlled bank or other bank, soft loan, I go buy a tanker. I take the money out, buy a tanker, I make a good money. It's not that Rosneft goes out and buys all these tankers. No, this is private business. So it's a great business in Moscow until the moment when my tanker gets arrested, and then nobody's going to save me. Putin is not going to be looking after my tanker. It was my own business, my own enterprise, and my contract was the Russian energy company. So yes, I think sanctioning specific tankers can be extremely effective, and I hope after the elections we're going to go back to it.
Excellent, thank you. Any further questions? Yes.
Rachel Ziamba, NYU, and other places. Elina, you mentioned at the end, sort of both export controls and insurance and saying that both were nodes that the US or the West didn't control. I'm wondering if on the insurance side, there was an element of, missing an opportunity and a window. Right, and so just to draw that distinction, and my view is probably the cat's, out of the bag. I mean, you've now had the creation of these insurance that Rosella in your commentary, but in thinking about what the lessons we learn, just just your thoughts on that. Obviously, Russian insurance firms and alternates are not, controlling all of it, but just your thoughts on that. Although you mentioned the impact of insurance and the Red Sea costs and the like. I'm just wondering if you have any more color on how those dynamics are impacting Ukraine's ability to get grain out and Russia's ability to get grain and fertilizer and other, sort of trade out in that context. It doesn't feel like there's been as much written about that recently in the context. Are they getting, longer journeys, or just any thoughts that any of you have on that?
I'll do quick answer the Red Sea and then go ahead. It's really kind of interesting in thinking about the necessity of the Red Sea route. I mean, everyone's going around the Cape of Good Hope, and that's adding like 30 to 50% longer time. And so the Russians themselves, though, have a deal with the Houthis that makes it moot. So they're actually not getting targeted anymore in the Red Sea, so they can keep their routes as is. So that's really not a problem for them. And so everyone else is taking the time to go all the way around Africa instead. And so it's really a choice that all of these shippers have to make for themselves as well. And so the insurance market is not actually really a problem in the Red Sea because if you're going to be targeted, you've now chosen a different route. And if you're not going to be targeted, then you're not facing risk and peril. So there you go. So it's a very different, much more stable in that sense. Obviously there's operation, which I don't have to go into, but so the other thing is security guarantees with what the US Navy is doing, as well, which doesn't seem from the little I've seen have much difference with the insurance markets, as well. But to your question.
Thank you.
Continue the question.
Thank you. Yeah, and I actually have a question back to you as well.
I'll try.
So on the insurance, I agree with you. It was missed opportunity because in the beginning of the war, I think we had, I don't know, 20, 30 maybe of the Russian seaborne oil going with a shadow fleet. And now it is 80 and more going with shadow fleet. So that's beyond the reach, right? And that's sort of eroded completely compliance. We did have an attestation process at the time, right? Which was in theory, wonderful idea if there were a credible threat of secondary sanctions. But if you tell me that, Elina, fill out this piece of paper, say I had no income this year and I'm going to pay zero tax, I'll file it somewhere and that's it. And IRS never comes after me. At some point, I will stop filling out that piece of paper, right? So it has to be a very credible threat, either probability of being caught times the cost of being caught, right? Versus the benefits that I'm getting. So it's a very simple risk calculus. And with that attestation process, we lost the opportunity. I do have a question on insurance because right now, with the IMO, there are certain regulations, right? International Maritime Agency, that me as a coastal state, and I can exercise my right to protect, right? If they come into port, there are certain rights I can exercise. If they don't come into port, so what can I do? Because is there enough information of insurance, right? And also, IMO is now headed by somebody from Panama, wonderful, probably person. But are there enough regulations on that?
No, it's a great question. Like, how is the shadow fleet so successful? And I don't have an answer to that question, but I've also wondered that myself. I should also note, in thinking about long-term adaptation to any conflict as it drag on, states adapt. Markets adapt, states adapt. And so Russia is going to go towards developing its own more insurance market, which is more interesting is China developing its insurance markets. And that's really, really, to me, the bigger implication of this, because they're like, this can be weaponized and be quickly. So why don't we develop our own insurance? And so we're not beholden to mostly EU regulatory power vis-a-vis insurance markets.
Mr. Drisner?
Yeah, actually, one question for Phil. You just went into the question I was going to ask, which is, what do you think the insurance market is going to look like 10 years from now? Like, what you're talking about is the way in which Ukraine and the West adapted to what happened in the Black Sea. But obviously Russia and China are watching as well, and they are also potentially other countries that might deal with the coalition of sanction are watching this. Are you likely to see a sort of bifurcation in the insurance market where there are insurers that frankly aren't affiliated with the West? What does that mean?
Yeah.
In terms of export controls, the question I have is that when in the financial sector, basically OFAC switched from a strategy of, sort of trying to go after everyone to a strategy of will. They basically sanctioned a couple of big banks, upwards of $10 billion, and that was clearly the thing that caused, the financial sector to realize this was a big deal. They had to adjust. What is the likelihood that in terms of export controls, you could see PIS or someone else trying to impose levies of that magnitude? Are you likely to see a whale hunting strategy for this?
So great question. My instinct is so what I'd like to see first, and then my instinct. One is preparedness for more state-backed insurance regimes and familiarity with that scheme to come in other types of conflict to be ready. So I was reading something about Israel saying, hey, as this conflict starts to potentially expand, we may want a state-backed insurance regime as well. So I think thinking in advance before conflict, that way we need to resurrect this. When we were doing this with Mariya, when she was there with me in the supers, it was about the Indo-Pacific. And I'm like, let's think about this in advance so we're not caught off guard, so we can keep commerce flowing. So that's the first thing. And I think it'd be the maritime insurance is fascinating and complicated as we have bigger and bigger ships with higher risk and increasing conflict. And I'm learning about it every day, but my instinct would be an increasing decentralization away from the West in the long term. But that's my instinct.
I think the whale hunting is the only strategy that could work, because we have, I think, one enforcement person in Hong Kong from PIIE, right? There's no other strategy that can possibly work. We have a big issue here, well, I think that's why following this congressional debate is very interesting, because the lawyers from this company say this is not illegal. This is the map to me, this AR rules on export controls to HS codes. Is it the legally binding mapping? For example, end use military and end use military end user. Well, but if I do it indirectly, I'm off the hook. So there is this legal debate. So we need to have Department of Justice working together with PIIE. I think they're beginning to do that. I think we have seen some hires, but they need to bring the big guns to pursue a couple of cases, or one big, at least whale hunting. And otherwise it's just, I don't think it's technically not possible. Also because if we talk a lot about economic security and sovereignty here, our data is not meant to produce the analysis for supply chain analysis. Our balance of payments data doesn't provide you the information, right? How are you going to enforce foreign direct product rule? There is no data. The way we find the data is either indirectly or having the companies self-disclose, which, some companies actually are very cute. When company is sort of a little bit in shit, then it comes and talks to us. When it's very deeply in there, they pretend nothing is happening, because of course that's way too late for self-disclosure. So I'll stop here.
You're up next, Professor. I just wanted to ask Professor Grinberg just a quick question about strategy. So we just heard, from Russian President Putin, who seems to have suggested that under certain circumstances, Russia may declare itself at war with, NATO, the United States, or some of the Western backers, supporters of Ukraine. We still don't understand what kind of circumstances can lead to such a declaration. And it certainly is going to be a unilateral declaration as long as Western countries are very reluctant to raise the possibility that they are at war with Russia. But if Russia goes ahead and says, after a massive drone strike by Ukraine, we believe that we are at war with countries A, B, and C, NATO members, will that, according to your model, put additional pressure on Western governments to crack down on, trade and economic interaction with Russia? How can that play out in this sort of equilibrium that you've kind of drawn up for us? Thank you.
So if that were to somehow have happened, and I put a lot of doubt on this because I don't think Russia would declare war on literally half the planet. That might be a bit problematic. But if it were to happen, I don't think it could be a unilateral declaration. I think the United States at that point would find itself at war. But if somehow that situation were to occur and we would have an actual war between the United States and Russia, I do think that the commercial policy would necessarily have to change to reflect that. Because a war between the United States and Russia would change, a declaration of war would change the nature of the war in itself. There would now all of a sudden be all sorts of legal provisions that could be used by a government, and I'm no optimist. If a government can have more power, especially in war, it will take advantage of the more power that it has. And the war context opens up a lot more tools for government to use.
Thank you, Professor.
Yes, I just want to go back for a moment to the question of insurance.
Yes.
The possibility of developing of a kind of parallel insurance market in Russia and China sounds very good, but why has this not happened? Who are the takers that have to agree that they would work for them? What can that tell us about the possibility of this happening or not in the future? Because you have the tanker owners or other economic players themselves, you have the possible third players in something which there could be a damage, then you have the issue of the reinsurers. So why it hasn't happened?
No, it's a great question. I don't have an answer, but I think for Russia, as it's thinking about it, how are they going to make those payments out? And how are those payments going to be credible? And what are they going to be paid in? And I think that is not very enticing for shippers.
So they have to be credible vis-a-vis
Ship payments being their payouts, right? Is it going to be paid out in rubles? Is it going to be paid out in different currency? Do they have easy access to SWIFT and other mechanisms to make these payments? So I think that makes this a more complicated industry to stand up. And also, you know, these are not these you have to accept if a crew is a third party national, right? You're ensuring their lives. If the hull and the cargo belongs to whom? Who does the ship belong to? So there are multiple players. It's one thing if this was all completely nationalized. These are Russian ships with Russian crews or Chinese. Well, China actually is building their commercial shipping industry with very robustly, right? So this could be a different situation. But so who are all these parties responsible to? And where does that credibly bake in for all of these parties in a very not very, but in a somewhat disaggregated industry where it's not tied to that nation's flag. So I think Liberia is the biggest flag in the world.
Can I jump in for a second?
Please.
It has happened before. So it hasn't happened in a systematic situation where countries stood up and kept their companies before, but countries have come in and backed up insurance when Europe used secondary sanctions to cut off their insurance market. So I'm gonna get my dates horribly messed up, but 2010, 2013, when Europe was part of the effort to put sanctions on Iran, they put secondary sanctions on the insurance industry. And South Korea, India, looking up my cheating here, and Japan, I think, instituted partially government subsidized institutions to help fund fleets to transfer the oil instead.
But these are moments. These are these momentary public-private partnerships, and you're asking for a sustained insurance underwriting industry, right? So the moments are there to supplement for that moment, the wartime conflict moment. But why isn't this a full-blown, regime?
Okay, so let me then go to Alona Epifanova, if I may, and just channel the question that one of the speakers raised rhetorically in one of the earlier panels today, and that is why, I think you just suggested that the IT sort of leverage, the IT statecraft has been leveraged to a very significant extent against Russia in this situation. But the question was, why wouldn't, IT majors just disable devices with Russian SIM cards, or go all out to, really punish Russia by, essentially prohibiting the use of their devices through, geo-positioning kind of trackers, or by means of detecting the country origin of the SIM card that is being used, and so forth. So what is it that is holding them from using this seemingly nuclear options? Is it for Apple, for example, is it consideration of profit that it's going to lose because the gray imports of iPhones and MacBooks are going to stop into Russia, or there's some strategic consideration? Maybe it's some government that holding Apple back from doing that. So what are your thoughts on that? And
Yeah,
I'm just
thank you.
channeling a question from someone else.
Yeah, I think there are very different approaches to that, depending also on the technology you look at. Before that, you asked about the power of the ethics. So this is one of the arguments, for example, especially when it comes to Microsoft. Also from my talks to them, they argue that, if we will switch off Windows, and I presented you the numbers of the market share in Russia, it's more than 80%. If we will switch off Windows in Russia, it means major hospitals, schools, and wherever will just go off, and we can't do it, right? Another argument from Microsoft is that it's easy to do so. It's easy to exit a market. It's not only about the Russian market, but they are on the market since 1992, and they're, of course, not super interested to leave the market. They have built a lot of business. So that's it's easy to exit a market, but it's not easy to enter it again. And a lot of IT companies are calculating re-entering the market, or the number what we see from the Kiev School of Economics, from the Leave Russia project, that the majority of the companies, they just scale down their activities in Russia, or they stop their investment in Russia, but they're still somehow waiting for the possibility to expand their market. So this is kind of explanation what we can see. Another one is if it comes to hardware, it's a different story, and with high-end chips, for example, it's much easier to track if they will be imported to Russia. With low-end chips, it's practically impossible, and it could be imported to Russia in different ways. The same with smartphones. Also, the situation is changing in Russia. We see that the market share of the Chinese smartphone, kind of Realme, Xiaomi, and so on, is increasing in the last years. Still, people continue buying Apple and the very last editions of that, and bring to Russia while buying it somewhere in Kazakhstan, Dubai, or wherever. So the thing is, you can bring the gadget into the country, but some features won't work, some updates might not work, but in general, it's a very solid, good Apple product which works in the country. And Apple is not able to completely disable it, and is not really interested to do so. And unfortunately, Apple also cooperates with the Russian state when it comes to censorship, and when it comes to deleting VPNs from the App Store, which also shows that Apple is rather interested to have their feet on the Russian market. And that's why I don't see any company which is kind of destroying their relationship completely with Russia, with a logic like they can return to the country. But again, if it comes to high-end tech, it's a different story. And also looking at NVIDIA, for example, you can see that Yandex and Sber, they experience difficulties to bring also a greater amount of high-end chips from NVIDIA enter the country. If we look at the development of supercomputer in Russia, so they are constantly degrading into the top 500. They still use NVIDIA, what they managed to have, or that they managed to bring into the country before the start of the full-scale invasion. But the development of the supercomputers from these major vendors, Bear and Yandex, are degrading in the on the international ranking.
Yeah, thank you very much. Perhaps just one last comment from Mr.
Just back
Kim.
on this question of insurance and bifurcation of the market, et cetera. As I understand it, the Russians, when they first felt like they might get squeezed out of the international P&I insurance market, right, for oil tankers, they went to the Indians and they went to the Chinese and they said, join up with us, we'll create our own. And the Indians and the Chinese said, no, thank you, we like the system we have already. Plus, if we want to continue to be able to send our ships to Europe and the United States, which for them is important,
Right.
they actually need insurance that we'd find acceptable. So I'm wondering, how could this bifurcated system work for China when it needs access to North American and European ports?
Right.
If we're not satisfied with their insurance, because that's the one thing you can do is you can say, you can't come into our port, you don't
Right.
like your blue card.
I don't have an answer, but I love the question and I want an answer and I get out of it because it's 3:30. I'm going to find you afterwards to ask you and talk about that.
Okay, so we are exactly at time, so please join me in thanking our terrific panelists.